The big question that we have when we start this interviews is normally what's the biggest topic to start with, but the other one is this a casting call for glasses, facial hair, and cardigans?
You said I was gonna like, man, I picked the best sweater,
I
right?
know, I
Uh,
know, I feel like
Always the
no,
professor thing, right?
it has.
well, the weather changed. The weather changed. It got cold.
It did.
The
Time
well,
to break out the cardigan.
I feel bad because I don't have one on, so everyone's got to participate in this. Next time, I'll bring one along just in case a
We'll
backup
get you
emergency
one.
one.
Well,
Mine,
we'll
mine
get you
doesn't
one.
have elbow patches. Does yours have elbow
No,
patches,
no,
Ian?
not yet.
What an exciting start. We want to get it on a fun topic, and today's really is a fun topic to start with as far as voter participation, voter registration. Today's Constitution Day. It's also voter registration day, and we want to focus on that. Voter registration is so important, of course, because you have to get registered to vote if you want to vote. Now, today's a particular day for it, but you can also, I think, very importantly for folks that are interested in this election, don't have the time, you can also register day of. Is that right here in California?
Yeah, we have same day voter registration. When you do that and then cast a ballot the same day, it's going to be a provisional ballot because they have to verify that you, in fact, are legally able to register to vote and cast a ballot before they will count your vote if you do it on the election day. But you do have the opportunity here in California to register up through election day. You just have to go do it in person at a polling place, bringing some documentation with you to demonstrate you are who you are and that you live where you live or where you claim to live. But yeah, it is available. I think the other thing is it's really easy to register online here in California. And you can do that for almost a month longer here in California. So yeah, we've done almost as much as you possibly can here in California to make it easy for people to vote or to register to vote and then to vote, because the state of California really wants everybody to vote who wants to vote.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the online piece is important to highlight because that was something that I think sometimes people are busy. And I know with my students, I actually just sent a video out to them going, you have access online if that's easier for you. So just to echo what Professor Smith said there, yeah, California really does try to make it as easy as possible for those who want to vote to actually vote. And I think that's also part of the key question here is those actually showing up and voting.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm gonna
Oh, go ahead.
uh, the making it easy for those who want to vote does not mean that California's system is prone to fraud. However, it's not, I mean, you do have to demonstrate that you have a legal right to vote in order for your ballot to be counted here in the state of California. So it's not that anybody who wants to vote can show up and, you know, register to vote and then cast a ballot and somehow change the outcome of an election here in California. We have a number of procedural checks to make sure that you are who you say you are, and that you live where you say you live, so that when you cast a ballot, you are voting in the contest that you are legally allowed to vote in.
Right. And how does this boost participation in elections, especially the way that California does, maybe in ways that are different from other states? I think the fact that you can vote from home, and California's made a big point of that, while you may suffer the consequence as far as how fast the vote gets counted, at the same time, the access has been expanded with the current system.
I mean, it's exactly as you say, right? So because it's really easy for people to register and then vote here in the state of California, we have made it possible for lots of people who otherwise might not have voted to cast a ballot, right? When we moved to permanent vote by mail status in the state of California, where you could just constantly vote through the mail, we have made it possible for lots of people who otherwise might not have voted to do so. Now, that said, we have lost the fun of Election Day. We have lost the celebration of Election Day. I'm thinking back to when I first moved here to Stockton, or shortly after I moved here to Stockton, the guy who ran the polling place in my neighborhood went door to door to make sure that everybody came to his garage to vote, right? And we don't have that anymore because it just doesn't exist. We have voting centers, we have people casting their ballot through the mail. And so we know that that kind of celebration and that kind of communal activity can actually drive some turnout, and we have lost some of that in this transition. And then, as you said, it takes a long time to count ballots now. And part of that delay is figuring out whether or not the people who cast the ballot should have cast a ballot, like were they legally allowed to cast a ballot? Part of that is just waiting for the ballots to arrive and get processed. It just takes a long time here in the state of California.
And I think one of the interesting things when I'm talking to my students, when we talk about, whether, making voting accessible is important. But at the same time, just to kind of again echo what Professor Smith is saying there, is that I've noticed even in the classroom, right, this excitement about it just isn't really there. And I think part of that has to do with just how partisan a lot of our politics has become. Students have felt, it's interesting sometimes when we talk about just the election process, how little people understand how elections actually work. The local level plays an incredible role in that. And I think some of that disengagement has really driven some of this, where people are saying, well, I don't feel like my vote counted. And then they're listening to some of these sometimes unfounded claims and running with them without even really understanding, how did you register? Did you track your ballot? Who do you talk to really about these things other than just airing your grievances online? And I think that's one of the things that sometimes, may keep people away, is just either that lack of understanding or even that just, fear that somehow their vote doesn't matter.
Well, airing your grievances online can be a very cathartic activity we found for, many people, but
we make a lot of money on it.
But in the
It's not always constructive, however. It doesn't move anything forward.
It's funny. I was just listening immediately to my email to my students, because I make them do discussion posts, and it's not because it's an easy thing. It's like that's where people are engaging in political conversation, is in the comments section. And so we've got to really learn how to differentiate between people that are just trying to argue and real political conversation. And so it's kind of a new world to some extent with this digital interaction. But again, it's different arguing with this faceless person versus having a real constructive conversation, with your peer. And I think to some extent we've lost the art of having a conversation where we may not always agree.
Well, and something important to point out too, while we can get the cathartic comments out in the comments section there and just go for it. The other thing that's productive to do is to talk about, okay, how can you track your ballot? And you can also do that online as well. You can literally track your ballot, whether or not you've done it in person, I believe, or if you've of course mailed it online. There's that way to do it as well, and you can actually see it in progress. And I think it's just a matter of education, right? To let people know, because it doesn't always, even though it maybe comes from one source, at the end of the day, you have several different counties, different news organizations are going to highlight it. Some won't, some will, as far as where you can find that information, and it is there for folks.
So I'll just plug it. sos.ca.gov is your resource. The Secretary of State's website has all of the information that you need for A, getting registered to vote, B, learning at least about the state level contests and candidates. Your local registrar of voters will have the local candidates and the local issues. California, because we want you to vote and we want you to make an educated vote, we give you lots of information. Many states don't provide voter education pamphlets in the same way that we do here in the state of California. So many states don't even publish the ballot in advance, so that people don't know what is actually on the ballot until they go into the polling place or until they receive their ballot from their local elections officials. So California really wants you to make sure that you have the information you need, and the Secretary of State's website is your primary resource for that. But that's also where you can go to track your ballot, right? If you want to know if you put your ballot back in the mail, you want to know if it's been received, you can go there and they will update it. And as soon as it's been received, it'll show up as being received. If they're processing it before the election, you'll see a little bit of note about it's in process, it's been counted, right? You can track your ballot all the way through to make sure that it has been counted. And then if you notice that there's a problem, right, if in the ballot tracking it says that there was an issue, we've made it so that you can go to your registrar's office and fix the problem after the election. It's not like maybe you forgot to sign the outside of the envelope when you were sending it back. They'll make a note of that and say that there's a problem with the ballot because they can't open it and process it if there's no signature on the envelope. But then you can go and fix it if you notice that there's a problem, or if when they scan the signature and it doesn't match the one that they have on file, you can go and fix that. We call that remedying your ballot, right? We make it possible for you to do that. And this is also a reason why counting the ballots takes so long here in California, because we've given you lots of opportunities to fix things if something goes wrong in the voting process.
Right. And Ian, I must imagine that you have to feel some sense of pride. Normally, you're the person who's explaining this here locally. You have Professor Smith backing up as well.
I'm not a solo voice. I agree. Like, Professor Smith is absolutely right. When we talk about like just a large picture here, as you can see in this conversation, one, if you are interested and you're registered to vote, like if you want to register to vote and you qualify, there's a lot of resources to help you. And then also when we talk about making an informed decision, I take the ballot, the sample ballot, I'll take even the voter guide into the classroom, and you will be amazed how many people do not go past the first couple of pages. And like especially I was thinking like during the governor elections or the recalls, right? When we were looking at candidate statements, and maybe they'll get past the candidate statements or whatever, but they don't even look at the propositions or anything that's in there. So when we think about making an informed decision, again, the Secretary of State website, all that information is there. I mean, you can even go in and looking at past election results. You can look at the fair practices component and donors. I mean, it is all, it's not necessarily as exciting as watching it on TikTok, but that information is there. And so I think that helping people understand that it's not a secret. Nobody is necessarily trying to keep this from you, but really being an active citizen requires you to make some effort, right? And that you have to go, just because you registered to vote, you also need to have an informed decision. Right. And so part of what I also try to do when we advising people about, okay, how do I make this decision? The news can only give you so much, right? The Secretary of State website has information for you, but there are other sources out there too. I like to send people to govtracks.us. It has a great profile of every candidate. I mean, right now you've got Vice President Harris, who is also a U.S. Senator. And if you're trying to make decisions about, which way this person may vote, I mean, you can see their track record there too. You can actually go to the actual bills, right? Now, again, that's not as exciting as what you see on social media. But again, to Professor Smith's point, the information is out there, and if you're seeking it, you can find it.
Yeah, I'll throw out a couple more resources to follow up on the ones that Professor Anderson just said. Ballotpedia is a fantastic resource, and they do lots of local coverage as well as kind of state level or national coverage. So if you are struggling to find information about, I don't know, a local city, county commissioner, Ballotpedia often will have information there. And then CalMatters does a fantastic job every year of creating a kind of election guide at least for the statewide issues and statewide candidates. But for some interesting local races, they'll provide some additional information. But both of those are great places that if you just want to know, if you want a quick overview or some quick information. And yeah, the voter information guides can be a bit dense because it is a little bit like reading a law, because that's how we have to vote. That's what we're actually voting on, are laws. But there are places, as Professor Anderson said, where you can go find it, and it's just not that hard.
Right, and I think too, when you bring up CalMatters, that's a great thing, especially for the local races, and you can go through the state legislation that's been passed over the past year, what's been proposed, who's proposing it, and of course you can relate that back to the people. When you get your ballot, you can look back and say, okay, that's the person who's running for this seat, that's the person who's the incumbent or whatnot, and just kind of go through it and see what you think. With some of their legislation, you don't even have to read, although I'm sure people here would say definitely read the bills. If you just look at kind of what's inside of it and just the summaries and things like that, you'll be able to pull off some information that's really important. that'll maybe be helpful in informing your decision. Because, in that same respect too, we're not saying go read all of them because people don't have time in their day to read the whole piece of legislation. Sometimes, us as well as we're going through 30 different bills a day and things like that to look at. So, um, uh, a pivot from this, but staying really on the same subject as well, is the importance of voter registration and voter turnout, particularly here in the Central Valley and really here in the southern portion. We have the district in our DNA in our market in California 22, which is consistently one of the lowest turnout districts across the country, and that's Representative Valadeo's district. And he's of course being he's of course facing former Assemblyman Rudy Salas. It's a rematch from last time around. Voter turnout was very low, as was with a lot of California other House races during this past primary season. How do folks turn out from in this district? Because obviously the registration might be there, the registration might not be there as well. How do people take that next step? Because as we said, it's a complicated choice to be able to then make that extra effort to do so and really want to do so, because you may not even know you're registered in some situations, or you may not know that your registration's out of date in other situations. A lot of people don't have the time to see that, just depending on what their occupation is between the last election and, of course, this one.
So, I mean, the first thing is, again, I would go to the Secretary of State's website and check whether or not you're registered to vote. And if you've not voted in a number of elections, although I mean, in California, it's ridiculous how long you have to not vote before you get removed from the rolls. You have to not vote in 4 successive presidential elections. So that's 16 years from when you registered to vote to when they will finally kick you off the voter roll. We want you to vote that much that we're willing to let you hang around on the voter rolls. We'll make you inactive. So if you don't vote in an election, and then prior to every election, the registrar sends out a little postcard, and I've got my postcard sitting on my table at home that says you're registered to vote in the upcoming election, right? If that comes back to the registrar of voters, undeliverable something, then you get switched inactive, and then you have to go through some extra hurdles before you can actually vote. But did you get that little postcard in the mail? You're registered to vote, right? And they're going to send you a ballot in the coming weeks here. I'm forgetting when they actually send out the ballot. I think it's October 7th is when they start sending those out. But you can see whether you're registered to vote. And then because we want you to register to vote here in the state, as Professor Anderson said, you can do it online, right? And it's really easy to do online. And there's just a link on the website, register to vote. Click that, give them some information, and then you're registered to vote, and you can go on election day. If you do it in the next couple of days, they will still mail you a ballot, right? Because they've got time to process your registration and mail you a ballot. But it's there. Getting the motivation to vote is something a little different, right? The process of registering to vote is one thing, and as I said, we've made that about as easy as you possibly can. The next step is automatic voter registration, but there's all kinds of issues with that in terms of making sure that only the people who should be registered get registered, because of the various databases that have to be hit in order to validate voter eligibility. But being interested in politics, seeing the connection to your life, feeling like you've got something to add to the conversation, or that your vote is going to make a difference, feeling like you have enough information to make a choice. These are all things that are a little bit more ephemeral. These are all things that are a little bit more personal. And to some extent, these are things that we've lost as we've moved to vote by mail, because we don't have as many opportunities to have that communal experience anymore of it's election time, we're going to do it. We've spread it out over 2 months. It doesn't feel like an event in the same way that it used to. So that piece is a little bit harder.
I think, again, going back to that, the celebration of voting, I think that we go back to most people One, the economy is a big part of it. People have to work. And so if you don't see value necessarily in the conversation, the candidate, if you don't see them reflected in you, people are not necessarily going to show up. You can have all this. One of the things I talk with my students about is, it's not enough to have an opinion, right? And you need to be able to express that opinion. It's not enough to go in front of, the school board and yell at the superintendent, right? You really need to, one, know who your elected officials are. Like, everyone knows who's running for president right now, but I would question how many people know who their board of supervisor is, who is running for mayor, who sits on the city council. And so one of the things with Valadeo's district, it covers a lot of different territory. We've got a lot of rural areas in there. I think language barriers can be a component of it, but also the other part too is that I don't know if really what I've been seeing in candidates, if they're really speaking to what the constituents really want to hear. And I think that some of that disconnection, where it's just kind of a lot of the same old narratives or taglines, I think people are exhausted as another part of this too. When, just as Professor Smith pointed out, it's been feeling like 2 years of campaigning, and especially with the switch recently from Biden to Harris, people are having trouble just keeping up at the national level. And I argue that the presidential election is very important, but it's probably even more important to know who your governor is, to know who's running at the local level. And not only that, like, you have a much better opportunity to engage with your local congressperson, your local state representatives than you might with the president, right? And so, again, placing value back on what not only just the value of voting, but also the idea of civic engagement. I think we tend to sit here, a lot of people sit here and go, well, you just need a new president and everything will be better. But we don't really understand how the whole system works and how bills become law. And so I think there's exhaustion with some of that too. So as much as we can make it reduce the barriers for people to be able to register to vote, we really do need to re-engage that whole idea of that it is our responsibility and our duty to engage in voting. So that's my platitude on that anyway. So,
Well, it's true because it seems like the sense is that perhaps the way to properly engage people in this generation has not been necessarily thought out yet, or hasn't been particularly successful in a wide in mass, right? Because I don't know, I always grew up in the I mean, obviously I grew up with some smartphones, but I felt like I was part of like the schoolhouse rock generation of you watch all those videos and you kind of getting good knowledge of it, and that's why I feel like maybe I have a good background. I don't know if that's still being taught in schools today or things of that nature. Just the way people perceive politics from a young age is a lot different than what it is now. So,
Yeah, I mean,
right.
I'd be curious, Professor Smith, what your thoughts are on that, because I have as well.
so there are a few things. One, younger people are voting at higher rates in this generation than equivalent age groups in the past, right? So more 18 to 24-year-olds will vote in this election in all likelihood than last presidential election, than the prior presidential election, than the prior presidential election. I mean, we used to say that age and education were, they still kind of are the primary predictors of who's going to vote and who doesn't. But the age connection is not as strong as it used to be because younger voters are voting more than they used to. Now, are we effectively communicating with them? I struggle to communicate with my teenagers or my teenager, right? So and I'm not on the same systems or the same platforms that they are. My students say things in class and I will just fully own, I don't know. I'm not familiar with it, right? My references are not their references.
Have you tried?
And that has happened to me too. And so all of a sudden I'm like, wait, this worked 2 or 3 years ago. Now nobody knows.
Yeah, I mean, it moves so fast, right? The cultural reference points change so quickly and they are so varied right now that we don't have those kind of common things.
Have you considered trying making TikToks about how to use Cal Legislate? Taylor? No?
I have made my classes go through Cal Legislate. I have made them find actual code on the legislature's site. They hated me for it, but we've done the deep dive to figure out what the law actually says and what the regulations actually say on the things that they care about, just to A, know where to find that kind of information, but B, to see that it's not the same as what we think it is, or that we think it ought to be. Um,
I was going to say real quick, that's hilarious because I have a similar assignment in my student. I call it the policy paper. And what they have to do is they need to select a piece of legislation, an actual piece of legislation, any topic they want, right? And then they have to, in the first one, give me an overview and then argue for it. And then in the second paper, they've got to argue against it and then give me a final presentation at the end, both sides and whatever. And I send them to force them to use, Congress, the Library of Congress. I do, California State Legislature, GovTracks, and we actually go through and we look at the pieces of legislation. And I go, look, you cannot, I don't care what topic you pick. If you want to use abortion as your topic, that's fine. But my goal in this assignment is that you need to actually look at the pieces of legislation. There's this high level philosophical discussion on gun control, abortion, immigration. But when you actually start getting into the actual legislation, you find that this conversation is very complex. There are all these different ideas on how to solve this, and that it suddenly, when you start to see, a presidential candidate making some sort of claim about any of these topics, understanding what, first of all, that only 7% of bills may actually even become law, and you can actually, like when I try to get them to go, okay, you heard this. And so maybe you're concerned about a nationwide abortion ban. Well, let's go and look at, instead of going down the TikTok, poll or whatever, well, let's see what pieces of legislation related to abortion are in Congress now, right? And where are they? And most of the time, when I bring it up and I show it on the screen, it's almost always been introduced, and that's really it, right? And with most of these topics. And so I go, again, you need to decide what matters to you, right? But you also need to look at not just your viewpoint of it, but what does the other side say? And I kind of go back to, what's happened with the younger generation is that I blame social media a lot because we tend to just continually see what we want to see. The algorithms are designed to send us exactly what we want, and they're profit driven, right? So it's not necessarily, a journalist trying to have create a conversation. It's almost always skewed towards whatever is popular at the time, and that's not always reflective of what most people think. So, but yeah, so Professor, I feel good, I guess, that my students feel the same way about me with my assignment. So, but I might take your idea. That's a good one.